Hello, welcome to Farmgate. I'm ffinlo Costain, editor of 8.9.com. Towards the end of last year, the National Infrastructure Commission for Wales made a recommendation to Welsh Government. Nature should have a voice in decisions about flood policy and infrastructure. Today, we ask why, how, and what difference would it make if nature had a voice? Dr David Clubb is chair of the National Infrastructure Commission for Wales, and Eurig Salisbury is a poet and a lecturer at Aberystwyth University. Welcome both. David, why did NICW make this recommendation to Welsh Government that nature should have a voice in decisions about flood policy? And what does it mean for nature to have a voice?
It's a great question to kick things off, because this isn't something that I've thought about for years. It's something that's relatively new for us as a commission. The recommendation to Welsh Government was one of 17 that we made. So it was a small but not insignificant part of what we were trying to do, because nature historically, as with community, have not been particularly well represented in discussions about flooding. We've talked to quite a few communities around Wales, and there's a disconnect there, I think, between the statutory bodies who have the responsibility and how communities sometimes feel that there's that interaction. And we felt that the two overarching themes for all of our recommendations were nature and community. And nature has a really big role to play. We know that in flood alleviation and in land management. And we felt as though that profile wasn't strong enough, and we wanted something that would help policies within Wales reflect more the value that nature brings.
So you've talked there about, some of the things that, one would expect the NICW or farmers or other policymakers to recognise the way that flooding impacts on land. But that's different, isn't it, from nature itself having a voice in the decision-making process. And so I just wonder, what that means for nature itself to have a voice rather than for other people just to sort of think about the way that flooding impacts on nature and vice versa.
Yeah, in principle, Welsh Government already has the framework, the policies whereby nature should be a consideration in all decisions. So there's the Environment Act, there is the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. Both of those require aspects of nature to be brought into decision making. But as we know, nature in Wales is very depleted. Wales is one of the most nature depleted countries on the planet. I think 1 in 6 species in Wales is at risk of extinction. So clearly, even though those acts have been implemented for 10 years or more, they haven't made sufficient difference to prevent nature being at risk. So we believe that there's something more strategic needs to be done at the governance level. And that's why having a voice for nature within that decision-making arena is hopefully going to prove quite instructive, because it's harder to ignore something when it's in the room with you. And of course, we haven't got nature itself there represented, but what we're doing is aiming to bring in voices of people who have some sort of expertise within the world of nature, whether that's conservation or law or policy or advocacy. And I think the idea behind the concept is that human is there just to represent nature from their perspective. They're not going to capture the whole of nature, but they're going to do the best they can from their perspective, and therefore raise it as a salience within the discussions that are taking place.
So it sounds like an eminently sensible thing for NICW to recommend, for Welsh Government to accept. So what did Welsh Government say?
Well, they rejected most of our recommendations, and that was one of the ones that they rejected. I think they felt that it was something that was too radical on the governance front to be implemented in a short time frame. And I get that, because there is a political context here. The elections for the Senedd are in May 2026. And I think it would probably have required a change that was too great within too short a space of time. However, that doesn't stop us as an independent body from implementing it ourselves. So what we did was take a look at the recommendation we made to Welsh Government. And then we said, OK, well, if we're making that recommendation to others, shouldn't we look at that ourselves? And that's where we came with the idea of bringing in our own advisors to help us think about nature. And prior to doing that, we contracted some support with doing that, Eurig being one of those who we talked to.
And just sort of, moving on slightly with that, Welsh Government, you say, rejected a lot of the policy recommendations. What sort of recommendations were they rejecting? And was that on the basis of money or policy or political will? What were the main reasons?
Resource is clearly a big issue for Welsh Government and other public bodies who are associated with managing flood risk in Wales. And the problem, as described to us, was that if they were to be working on the recommendations that we've made, they would have to drop things they were currently working on. Now, some of them, the recommendations we made, I don't think would have taken a lot of resource within the staff. Some of them could have been accepted in principle, and then we can work on those later, type of thing. So we thought they were being less ambitious than they could have been, if I put it that way. We would have liked to see, for example, a commitment to increasing the amount of spend year on year on natural flood management. So we know there's a big capital budget for flood management, usually for grey infrastructure, and Welsh Government are currently spending £2 million a year on natural flood management, which is great, but that's a tiny fraction of the overall spend. So I think it would have been really encouraging to see acceptance of principle, even if things can't be worked on immediately. So that we're still in discussion with Welsh Government on that.
And as you say, it's a flood report looking forward to 2050. So we're looking really at 25 years of change, and actually an awful lot of the change that's necessary is really needed in the next 5 years, isn't it? But if we're looking at a 25-year trajectory, then you'd have thought accepting things in principle wasn't necessarily a difficult thing to do politically.
Well, we're continuing to go down that road, so discussions haven't finished yet. But you're right in that the changes should be made sooner rather than later if you're to capture the maximum benefit from them. We saw some fantastic examples in the Banau Brycheiniog where farmers were managing their land much better to capture water within the soil. That improved water retention, improved soil quality, improved the output of the crops. So the Usk catchment is doing some brilliant things there, and other farmers are very interested. So interestingly, this isn't coming from, here's a policy, you've got to implement it as a farmer. It's coming from the point of view where other farmers could see that their land, even in times of drought, is far greener and far more resilient than their own. So they're coming to view and to understand what's happening. And I think that's quite encouraging, because policy can only do so much. Really, you need cultural buy-in and you need acceptance within that community. So I think change is coming, but that's the one side, the practical side. It would take a very long time for that to happen right across Wales, just through word of mouth. What we'd like to see is something more rapid happening on the policy front. And again, I think this is where potentially having that voice of nature at the governance level can help speed things up.
It's really interesting to hear you mention the Usk catchment there, because of course an awful lot of farmers are very comfortable with the idea that they're growing food to feed their communities, and actually when it comes to flooding, that's a very sort of clear and present reason for managing land differently, because you're managing that flood risk for your community as well, aren't you? And that's certainly something that they've been working to deliver in the Usk catchment, which has been very impressive, I think, and can be sort of seen nationwide across the UK as something that's really important. So NICW, having heard that Welsh Government didn't want to do this, accept this at a national level, the idea of taking nature onto the board, NICW decided to go ahead anyway. So what do you hope will change as a result?
We had our first meeting with somebody who was there to represent nature a couple of weeks ago, to test what it would be like before we committed to the next stage. And it was interesting, it was valuable. We had contributions from Dr. Juliet Rose, who carries out this function for Faith in Nature. So she's quite experienced doing it. And I think the fear potentially from people who might not have experienced this sort of governance conversation is that that extends the length of discussion of every agenda item, and in principle makes meetings a little bit more unmanageable. That wasn't our experience. Juliet provided some useful contributions where she had some to make, didn't where there wasn't anything that she wanted to say on behalf of nature. And I think our commissioners were reassured about that. And that's why we were really keen then to proceed with appointing somebody on a 6-month trial basis to do that same role, with the idea being, if that's successful, we will publish our experiences, publish the outcomes, and then look at potentially carrying on that pilot in perhaps 6-month spells with different nature guardians, and then making a recommendation to Welsh Government on the basis of that, a second recommendation that would be. We're also thinking about organising an event towards the end of this year to coincide with that 6 months, to get people together in a room. We want to have people who are supporters, we want to have people who are skeptics, we want to have umbrella organisations for organisations in Wales, and we want to try and encourage that debate to take place to help promulgate the idea, as long as we think it's worked for us. If it's not worked for us, I think we're going to come out and say that as well.
Now, I want to come on to the meeting that you had and, the sort of things that were discussed with, nature being there present in the room a bit later. But I wonder if we can just talk for a moment about, where the idea came from. So when we think about nature on the board, we can also think about it as nature guardianship. And guardianship isn't unique, is it, within a kind of a legal or decision-making system? You have guardianship in other areas as well.
That's right. And what the nature guardian role has done is taken legal precedent from elsewhere and embodied it within the structure of governance. So, for example, in New Zealand, there's a river there that has a status as effectively as a legal entity itself. There are other countries in the world where they've adopted this sort of route down a more legal process as well, so that natural elements have their own legal protection in the same way as an individual. But I think this is something a little bit different because what we're doing is having the voice within the boardroom, or the commission in our case, party to all the discussions, informed hopefully by all the same things that we're all informed by. And we don't necessarily expect each nature guardian to have all of the evidence, all of the information. Clearly, they're coming at it from their own background. So somebody with a legal background will take a legal perspective on things. Somebody from a conservation background might take that perspective. But that's all part of informing us as the Commission, informing them as the nature guardian, hopefully more things about infrastructure as we're talking to them. And even were they to say nothing the whole session, they would be witness to what we were discussing. And I think it's harder to ignore nature if there is a witness there looking at what we're doing and listening to what we're talking about.
Mm. And is the sort of the process transparent? Because you talk there about the idea of having a witness, but of course a witness behind closed doors is slightly different to a witness where there's an element of the sort of the public looking in and seeing what the witness is witnessing as well. How does that balance work?
We do publish all of our minutes of our meeting, so there will be a public record of everything that we discuss. But I think the more interesting thing for me is this reflection in public, this learning in public. So I've asked the person that we're appointing as the first nature guardian to note their feelings, their thoughts about the process as we go along. I've asked the same of all of our commissioners and the secretariat. So I'd like to publish this reflective piece at the end to say, how did we change during this experience? What were our expectations at the start of it? And has it delivered really? Do we feel that the discussions we've had would have been different in some way without having that person present?
Now, David, as we've sort of said, the idea of incorporating nature as a key stakeholder was a recommendation in the recent NICW report, Building Resilience to Flooding in Wales by 2050. How will nature having a voice change your approach to flooding, do you think?
Well, that's a question that I can't easily answer because, in principle, those decisions are taken by Welsh Government, Natural Resources Wales, local authorities and others. So really it would be for them to think about their response, were they to have that voice of nature within the room as they're making their discussions. What I think it's done for us is given us the opportunity to think about our own decision-making process and to increase the visibility of the concept. So it was already out there. We had Simeon Rose from Faith in Nature, who's really taken this concept and pushed it very hard. He presented at our flooding report launch in October last year. And really, that was the catalyst for us thinking that we could do something a bit more with this. Now, I have to come back to the concept for us, which is it should be improving our understanding of issues around nature. It should be improving our decision-making process. It should be improving our governance. If we find it doesn't do that, then we're not going to be supporters of the principle. But I think this principle is too important to be ignored. And as an independent body tasked with providing radical suggestions to Welsh Government, we're in exactly the right place to be testing it. So we're an easy pathfinder, if you like, for then other public or private bodies to sit behind and for us to help inform others.
Just before I go across to Eurig, I wonder if you could help me with, again, understanding the role of nature guardianship and how that might create more of a focus on natural processes. Now, at the time the report came out, I was critical that soils didn't feature more heavily, where in my view, they should be central to flood policy because healthy soils have such phenomenal water holding capacity, where, the converse is also true, that unhealthy soils or compacted soils just immediately lead to runoff and accelerating flooding events. If nature had been represented at that time, do you think that that's the sort of thing that might have been better captured? Because, as I say again, looking at the report, I think soil was mentioned 3 times. When I'd opened it, and I was quite excited about opening the report, I was expecting a whole chapter on soil and soil function.
Yeah, you might well be right. That's possibly a gap in the report. We commissioned pieces of work to underpin that research, and maybe the brief for the consultants wasn't specific enough on that, or maybe they weren't aware of that role of soil. So somebody there who had the voice of nature might well have picked up on that and helped us. I think this is the thing. If we can have things that are shaped for us at an earlier stage within the process, so for example at procurement, that might then help shape the whole of our research and then shape the final outcome. So it may well have added value at that stage. I mean, we'll never know, of course, for that particular report, but hopefully for future ones that will play a role. So we're currently working on our report for this year, which is about how people understand and communicate on climate change in the long term, and about how utility companies are preparing themselves for long-term resilience. So that voice of nature is going to be present as we're drafting this report.
Thanks so much, David. Now, Eurig, I'm interested in your role in all of this because, of course, you're a poet. You're not part of NICW yourself, but you were brought in to help to make the case for nature to be on the board, to be part of decision making. So from an emotional and perhaps artistic perspective, what do you think it means to represent nature?
Well, I immediately liked the idea, that concept, if you like. It appealed to me as a poet. This idea that you could, in effect, personify, or try to at least personify nature by giving it a seat around a table, where decisions are made. I think that fundamentally creative. It is a fundamentally creative idea, I think, and it did make it easier for me from the outset to empathize with nature, with the natural world. In my mind, it gave nature a face, if you like. And I started to think then what that face would look like, perhaps, and more importantly, what nature perhaps would say, sitting opposite me. And it's then when I started to feel slightly uneasy, because of course nature has been here for a very, very long time, far longer than we have. And nature would presumably take issue with a lot of the things that humans have been doing and so on. So I had to pause there and think, right, okay, well, what sort of conversation would this be? Now, personally, I'd find it hard to imagine what it would mean to represent nature as such, because I've little expertise in that regard. But I can imagine, as a creative practitioner, I can imagine how I'd feel trying to start a conversation with nature, and I think that's one of the places that I started, and it was it was very useful to me, that creative idea.
I'm interested that you talked about the face of nature. What would nature look like if it was sitting across the table from you? What would it say? And I wonder if you could share with us some of your thoughts about what nature might look like. Was it male or female? Was there wind instead of a beard? How did that work for you?
Well, it was a bit of a blank face to start off with, I think, in my mind's eye. But then I thought of other people that I've stood across the table from in board meetings and so on, and it started to come a bit alive. I won't pin down, I don't think, a certain face. I don't have an idea in that way. Not even a voice, perhaps, really, but I have a feeling what nature would raise with us, perhaps, or even perhaps nature would. I have a feeling nature would let us speak to start off with, to try and have an idea of what we'd like to tell nature, and then I don't know. It was very interesting to think about it, but I don't know if I've got any definite answers for you in that regard.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? As soon as you start trying to think about it, then it
Yeah.
becomes very, very difficult to pin anything down. And for me, while you were talking, I was imagining pictures of faces that were joyful, faces that were angry and raging, faces that were, representing different emotions. And there's almost a degree to which you end up with a throng of faces together, all sort of competing to be that single face. It's
We do.
really interesting. Now, National Infrastructure Commission Wales commissioned you to write an essay and a poem in support of nature guardianship. Could you talk us a bit through what was in the essay, and then maybe share some thoughts about your poem?
Well, basically, I think it comes down to language for me in the end. As I thought about that face, and actually, thinking about it, perhaps I didn't envisage a face or a voice, but I did envisage a tone, or perhaps a calmness. You mentioned there, feeling angry, perhaps, or angry faces, or perhaps joyful faces. Well, I envisaged a calmness, perhaps, that stems from the idea that nature is a long-term, slower thing, if you like, than us. So nature, I realized, it works on a different plane to us as humans. It's very much long-term. It can be very difficult for us in our short individual lives to find, common ground with nature. So that's where I started off from. So how would I start a conversation with nature? That's the difficult thing I found. This entity that has been here for a very long time, and then myself as an individual, I've been here for 40 years, 41, almost 42 years, perhaps in a few months. So that unnerved me a bit, thinking, what do we have in common? But what I came back to was language, in the sense that, yes, it's something we all have as individuals. We can use language, but language, of course, is a long-term thing as well. It stretches a long way back into the past. And I think this is true of every language. It's not, of course, it's clearly not unique to Welsh, but we're talking here about any language, any living language. It stretches far back into the past, and by using language, perhaps we can find some sort of common ground with nature in that regard, and start to talk with nature, because language does give us that long view, and I think that's particularly true and important here in Wales, because of course Welsh has been spoken here in this particular part of the world since time immemorial, and I don't think that's true of any other language on mainland Britain. And I think there's great importance to that. Welsh has been rooted here for a very long time. It's true of other languages, of course, where they've been rooted in their landscape for a very long time. Here in Wales, I don't think it's true of any other language except Welsh.
It's interesting, isn't it? And I please forgive me for using an English example, but it's one that I know, where in the second book of the Lord of the Rings, you come into contact with the Ents, who are people who are tree herders, and they talk about the hobbits being hasty little folk because, of course, they live short lives, and they will get together at their Ent meets, and their Ent meets will take days, if not weeks, because their words are so long, the language, and I find it fascinating that sort of Tolkien has sort of gone through this thought process, if you like, decades ago, where there are long words, long sentences, long thoughts that start to sort of summarize the approach that you're talking about, the glacial approach to decision making. And I wonder if you could sort of talk about the way that this long language, Welsh language, differs from the English language, and what you took from the Welsh language, I suppose, that helped you think about that long-term element of nature.
Well, I did think about the Ents as well as I was talking to you there. Actually, it was in the back of my mind. It's a great example. Well, in terms of the Welsh language, I mean, I lecture here in Aberystwyth University in the Department of Welsh and Celtic Studies on medieval Welsh literature and early modern, and sometimes even earlier poetry as well. And it's nature comes up, very, very often, as you can imagine, in those works, and you start to realize that this relationship with nature is a very, very long-lived thing in the language here in Wales. So the point that I am making basically in my essay is that it would be foolish to disregard that here when we're talking about nature here. If we're talking about nature in other parts of the world, of course, we're talking about other languages and other cultures. But if we're talking about it here, one perhaps small, but one important aspect of understanding our relationship with nature here would be to have an understanding of the language and its culture, and what's been here before. I think that's very important.
David, just really briefly, I wonder, you're both fluent Welsh speakers, I know, sort of native Welsh speakers. Are the meetings that you have at National Infrastructure Commission for Wales, are they in English or in Welsh?
They through the medium of English. So there are 3 fluent Welsh speakers out of the commissioners. So we conduct those through English. But you'll find quite often organisations in Wales, particularly public bodies, that carry out their meetings through the medium of Welsh with simultaneous translation available. I mean, the interesting thing for me in procuring Eurig's expertise was to try and highlight that importance and say that this isn't a new concept. Nature and governance shouldn't be new, because nature stems from, is part of our cultural heritage for a very, very long time. So what we're trying to do is reintroduce nature into our governance in the same way as beavers are being reintroduced into the Dyfi Valley right now. So it's welcoming nature back in rather than just generating this idea completely from scratch. I think in Wales, we've got that great cultural heritage to be able to make that argument.
Eurig, we were talking about your essay and talking about language there. I know that you wrote a poem in support of the idea as well. I wonder if you'd be happy to read that to us today.
Yeah, no problem. So this is it. It's a sonnet. Let's give a seat to nature on the board. But I've a feeling seeing eye to eye with nature may well mean a little more than sharing niceties, saying "Shwmai," and small talk just won't cut it. Not with one whose schedule works on a different scale to coffee breaks and tea, perhaps a bun. Think peat bogs, tree rings, melting pots of shale. But let's not say nothing, for all our sakes, across from its 2 stony eyes. Let's use the long view of language to give and take in kind. For our words alone are suffused with truth and knowledge the ages amassed in this corner of earth, both small and vast.
Wonderful. Great language in there. And and of course, you've got the tree rings as well, sort of linking us back to that earlier conversation. I love the idea of a tea break. I wonder what nature would do if it took a tea break. What would happen to us all? Now, David, you've had your first meeting with nature on the board, as you mentioned earlier on. Could you talk us through that? How did it go? Did anything surprise you?
It did. Yeah, it surprised me how easy it was, if I'm honest. I mean, we're taking a step into the unknown. I think any organisation which is doing this is obviously taking that step into the unknown. So we were very grateful that Juliet had previous experience and that she could take us through that. So she gave a little talk at the beginning on how it had worked for her and the organisations that she works with. And we carried on our meeting as usual. Juliet made interventions where she thought that she had something helpful to bring, and some of those were certainly from her professional background. She's a botanist originally, and she had lots of different ideas, particularly actually on the issue of nature on the board, because she's been involved with it and looked at some international organizations that are doing something similar. So she could bring in a lot of those perspectives. She made us aware of things that were going on. She works currently for the Eden Project, so things that Eden Project were doing. So it's not just about saying, I'm here to represent the wind and the sea. This is it's something a bit more pragmatic, and perhaps that was a little bit of a surprise to me as well, which is that Juliet can only bring what Juliet knows. She doesn't claim to be representing everything. And I think any organization doing this would experience the same, which is whoever you pick can only bring what they can bring. And it's not so much about, can this person know everything about nature? It's much more about, this person is doing their best to remind us that nature has a place here.
The way that you talk about that there's almost a sort of slightly pragmatic and process element to it. But was there anything that she said that that made you think about nature in a different way during the course of that meeting, or is that, something that will just come in time?
I think we've always been quite mindful of nature on the Infrastructure Commission since the new remit, which was in 2021. So it moved us as a commission from being something like a sort of more economic development focus to a more socio-environmental. So we're mindful of nature, but we don't often talk with nature in mind, if that sounds counterintuitive. Mindful of, but not with it present in mind. And I think that's what it does, is elevate it to something that's there, present and able to contribute in an equal way to any other commissioner. I think it also surprised me that our discussions didn't spiral into something around nature or other. It really didn't. It was quite pragmatic, and I think for me, and I think the other commissioners, it did feel as though it was a useful contribution. If it hadn't been, we probably wouldn't be going ahead with a 6-month pilot. And I was pleased the other commissioners really felt as though they got value from it too.
Yeah, good. And you mentioned faith in nature once or twice, and that Juliet had been involved with faith in nature. I think a lot of people listening won't be familiar with that. Just talk us through what that is, would you?
Faith in Nature is a private company, might even be a community interest company, but it manufactures washing products. And the Nature on the Board concept was really championed by Simeon Rose, who works for that organization. A couple of years back, I think it was probably 2022 or something like that, when he first started publishing on it. So it's not been a well-established concept in the UK, but somehow within the course of our deliberations, one of the commissioners had come across the concept, and it sort of aligned with all of our values. And I think that Simeon's proved that it can work within a corporate setting. What we want to do is prove that it can work in a public body setting, albeit we're very small, and we're non-statutory. So I think Simeon's been a brilliant pathfinder for us, and now hopefully we can add to the voice that he's provided by being a pathfinder for others, specifically within Wales.
David, Eurig and I were talking about the faces of nature, trying to pin anything like a face of nature or a voice of nature down. And you've talked there, I think, about the contrast between something which is wild and then being able to have nature represented, this wild thing represented, but at the same time within a pragmatic and a process, driven setting. And so this sort of brings me back to this sort of question of nature is big, it's all encompassing. And, it'd be fair to say that for many people, it's essentially the embodiment of God. So how can one person represent that? Even if nature's representatives are changing regularly, it's still just one person representing something that's fundamentally everything.
Yeah, I don't think we're aiming for perfection here. Wouldn't it be great if we could have Gaia herself sitting in the room for all of these meetings? I think what we're aiming to do is something that can fit within existing corporate law or public sector requirements, that does what it can to maintain the presence and the focus of nature without overly distracting from what would be the core operational or governance issues of any organization. So it's always a trade-off, but then life is a series of trade-offs. There's nuance in everything. As far as I'm aware, this is probably as good as we can do, but hopefully, this is the thing about doing things in the open, maybe other people will come up with their own suggestions of how to incorporate these voices or how to better safeguard nature. But it feels to me as though laws don't do it. We know the Audit Wales looked at all the public bodies in Wales who are supposed to have biodiversity plans in place, just around half of the public bodies had done so, and that's required. That's a statute of law in Wales. So if public bodies even aren't following law, then clearly the legal route, the stick route, if you like, isn't working. So this is something, it's imaginative, it could be playful, it's certainly very different. Hopefully it can inspire. And I think those are the sorts of things that we need to be looking at now. Less perhaps sticks and laws, important those are sometimes, but more about just a different way of doing things. We know culture is extremely important. And so this is changing the culture of the board and the nature of those discussions.
We've talked before in this conversation about the way in which nature works at a different pace. If you think in terms of oak trees or glaciers, and you're talking in terms of changing nature's representative, the nature guardian on a 6-monthly basis. Is that your way of trying to draw out different facets of this, this different time frame, so that you're able to sort of dwell on little bits at different times in order to get different aspects of nature's character?
Yeah, I think the 6-month rotation idea was Simeon's in conversation, and there's a lot of merit in that, I think, because you don't want to trap this knowledge within one or two individuals. I think this is the kind of skill and experience that needs to be spread quite widely. So on the one hand, you're effectively seeding nature guardians for use in other organisations at quite a rapid scale. On the other, we're benefiting from quite diverse viewpoints over a fairly short-term process. So I'm excited by the idea that we would have a number of different voices coming in. It raises challenges, of course, because in principle, if you were to do this as a public body with ministerial appointments, you would need to be appointing every 6 months, which actually isn't practical. What I think you would probably do was set up a pool of candidates. So you might say, right, we're looking for 10 nature guardians for whatever the public body is, and they'll be appointed on this basis, and then there'll be a call off. So you might get a call for 6 months of work during this four-year period. So I think I can see ways in which it would be workable. Other organisations might take a different perspective, and maybe they'd want their nature guardian to sit alongside their commissioners or board members with equal status for that whole period. But it does feel as though that ever-changing voice of nature fits quite nicely with a shorter turnaround for us, but we'll see.
Eurig, I want to go back to poetry and how nature is represented in Welsh poetry in just a moment. But before I do, I just wonder if you could give us a sort of personal reflection, having gone through your essay, gone through the process of writing that, sort of thinking about the faces of nature and writing your poem. What does nature mean to you personally, individually? Not trying to, sort of capture it and represent it in terms of public thoughts or nature guardianship, but just to you as an individual.
Well, as well as its immense importance in terms of our ability to continue to live here in the long term, I've also recently sort of had a chance to rethink what nature is really in Wales and its relationship with people. This links back to what Dave mentioned earlier in terms of the impact that people have had on nature in Wales. As an example, I went a few years ago on a field trip with colleagues from the university, from the geography department. We went to the highlands of mid Wales, the uplands, into the Elan Valley, series of reservoirs there. And I went there thinking that I was going to see, wild landscapes, untouched landscapes, if you like. But what was pointed out to me by my colleagues was actually everything I've seen has been changed by people, and I'd never thought about it in that way. Because you look at the mountains and the hills in mid Wales, and you think, yeah, it's pretty wild. And it was interesting to see what was written on the public information boards for tourists and visitors mainly, of course, and in the visitor centre, and how they framed what people saw around them. And it was very often framed with the words, wild and unspoilt and so on. And of course, from the point of view of Midlands in England, and of course from Aberystwyth even, it seems to be unspoilt and wild. But of course, for the trained eye, people can tell you actually, well, that that whole landscape has been changed by people in different ways. So that really changed the way that I think about nature in Wales. I used to think that there were pretty wild places in Wales, but actually there's very few places, if any, that fit that description really. Um, so I think in the long term, my thinking about nature here in Wales has changed to involve people a lot more and to just recognize that as a fact. Nature in Wales coexists in a very intimate way with people.
And how is nature represented in Welsh poetry, both modern poetry and more ancient?
Well, I think traditionally, what I what I've learnt over the years is that the Welsh poets, going back to the Middle Ages and before then, were very perceptive in everything that they did, but they were very perceptive in terms of what they saw in nature as well. Where they did very often use nature imagery from nature in their poetry, especially in their love poetry in the Middle Ages. Um, and they it's obvious that their understanding of nature isn't something that they've sort of casually thought about, um, as people would more likely do today, perhaps, to read about nature in a book or online, for example, without actually experiencing it and looking at it. I think what the Middle Ages, the poetry composed in that period, for example, shows us is that the poets were intimately aware of the natural world around them. And one example of that is the 14th century poet David Clubb. For example, he's regarded as the foremost poet in Welsh in the Middle Ages, if not in any age. And he composed. He's famous for his love poetry, and he composed a number of poems called Llatau poems. So Llatau means love messenger, and the idea is that the poet would send a love messenger to his beloved with a message. So he asks the seagull, he asks the wind also in another poem, he asks the skylark, I think, and in one poem that I refer to in my essay, he asks the roebuck to go on his behalf as a llatau. And it becomes obvious when you read the poem that David knew this animal well. It's not a picture of this animal that he's seen in a book, for example. He's seen this animal with his own eyes. And he describes it very, very well. And it fits in well with his objective as well in the poem, because the roebuck is a small, nimble animal, a small type of deer. But it's very it's not known in Wales today. I think there are some roebucks in Wales today, but they did die out for a period in the early modern period because they were hunted. And in the modern edition, one modern edition of the poetry of David ap Gwilym, this poem is entitled "The Stag," the Carw, the stag. But it clearly isn't a stag. But of course, a roebuck, or in Welsh, iorch, it wasn't a familiar animal or a familiar word in the modern period. So that poem on its own shows us, I think, very clearly how things have changed, but also how, at one period at least, poets and Welsh people, I think in general, knew nature very well and intimately.
I wonder whether you think that language or poetry or people's experience of mythology have helped to shape the Welsh landscape, particularly the human forged landscape. We started talking about reservoirs and the infrastructure, the way that need has shaped the landscape. But what about language and myth? Have they forged the landscape, the farmed landscape, the water holding landscape?
I think inevitably, yes, it has, because people have has lived so long here and spoken Welsh and have experienced the landscape in Welsh. And I think it works the other way around as well. I think the landscape has influenced the Welsh language and helped shape it as a language. If the language had taken root in another part of Britain or another part of the world, I think it would be different. How exactly, we'll never know. But I think the Welsh language as it is does reflect in some ways, of course, the landscape around it here in Wales. But all I would say 95% of the place names in Wales are in Welsh, for example, and very often, of course, they describe the landscape around us. And it's not a casual description, if you like. It's a very political, hot topic in Wales at the moment. The changing of place names. It tends to happen sometimes when homes are bought, perhaps by people from outside Wales, and the name of the house is changed from a Welsh name into an English name. But it also happens with landmarks. For example, parts of Eryri, Snowdonia National Park. There are places there which are very familiar, of course, to climbers who don't speak Welsh, and they've given their own English names to those places. And sometimes those places, those new names in English, are placed on maps, on modern maps, instead of the older Welsh names that have been there for centuries. And those newer names tend to be quite flippant, and again, they describe the landscape in some way or other. But the Welsh name does tend to reflect a deeper understanding of the landscape around it.
It's fascinating. I just sort of thinking when you're speaking there, even just about my own name, Finlo, which is a Manx name, but it's Gaelic, and obviously Welsh is a Gaelic language as well. And when I was a kid, when I visited Wales, many of the Blaenau Ffestiniog, for example, a lot of the Welsh place names would have the double F, and they would be in lowercase, as my name is. But gradually over the last few decades, they seem to have been anglicized, and you see lots of a capital F followed by a double F, which of course changes the sound from an F to a V sound. And there's something about when I try and communicate my name just generally to people, they find it really challenging, the idea that it doesn't have a capital letter, where for me it feels much harsher. Suddenly I see it with a capital F, and it changes the feeling of the name of the word, where the lowercase f just feels softer and it feels a bit more permanent to me. It's interesting. Can you give me any examples of where the Welsh language describes nature or a place, or perhaps the human relationship with a place, differently to the English language?
Well, one example that I do refer to in my essay is the tendency in medieval Wales, at least, to build hall houses on the side of hills, on the slope. Now, this was a practical thing, of course. The lowland valley would flood, perhaps, and was more prone to that sort of thing. And of course, the highland above on the mountain would be an unsuitable place to build a house also. So that place in the middle, because Wales, of course, is such is filled with hills and mountains, it does show, I think, that people knew their landscape well. That location, it's a very traditional location for a hall house. And since I learned this, when traveling around Wales, I tend to see, oh heck yeah, that must be an old house. That must be must go back to the Middle Ages and beyond, because its location, it's on the side of the hill and it's in a prominent place as well. And this became basically a convention in medieval Welsh poetry. Poets would praise their patrons and would refer occasionally to their houses and the location of their houses. They would be whitewashed, of course, as well, so they would be likened to stars and lamps and angels and so on the side of a hill, places that people could see for a very, very far away, from very far away. And there's one example I refer to is Moelwrch, not far from Llansilin, not far from Oswestry in northeast Wales. This poet, Gutor Glyn, he composed a poem of praise to this house when it was rebuilt. And it is praised in this way. And you'd see the convention clearly in this poem. The generous man lives in this house on the side of the slope where everybody can see it as like a beacon, if you like. But the miser, those withholding their money from the poets, they would live at the bottom of the valley, near the swamp, if you like. And you see this convention repeated time after time in the poetry in the period, and I think it speaks to the understanding of the landscape. I think the intimate understanding of the landscape.
Beautiful. Really lovely to hear. David, just to sort of bring us to the end of the programme, I'm interested that Welsh Government found the idea of nature in garden. I'm just going to start that again. Thanks, Eurig. That's beautiful. It's lovely to hear the way that you're describing that. David, I'm interested, just bringing us to the end of the programme, that Welsh Government found the idea of nature guardianship too radical. And I know they're my words and not yours, particularly because Wales already has the world-leading Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. Isn't this just an obvious next step?
Well, not obvious, I guess, in that it hasn't yet been done. So it's taken a while because we're 10 years on now from the implementation of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. But I do think there's a strong alignment, a cultural alignment with the aims and objectives of the Senedd and the Welsh Government. So Welsh Government has declared a nature emergency and a climate emergency. When the Senedd was set up, which is 25 years ago now, there was a commitment to having sustainability running through it like a golden thread, as it was said at the time. So in principle, Wales should already have nature at its core, should be fully sustainable. But the test I always apply is when you cross the border from Bristol to Newport, or go across to Wrexham or in mid Wales, what's the difference that you notice? And I'm sad to say, after 25 years of devolution, the only difference really is that the signs are bilingual, road signs are bilingual, place signs are bilingual by and large. Are the streets less littered? No. Is our towns and cities green places with nature thriving? Not particularly. So I don't think that devolution has delivered the nature dividend that we'd hoped for. So I think nature guardianship in principle could be an obvious successor to those early aspirations, but it hasn't been, and it does take radical people to think about these things and to make those changes. And I'm grateful for Simeon for coming to support us with that recommendation on flooding. And I'm grateful that the Infrastructure Commission has that space within civic society to be able to make radical recommendations and then to follow them up, even if it's not the right time for the rest of the public bodies in Wales. I get that. And I get why it might take ministers a bit of time to get their head around it. But we're committed to investigating whether it's right, first of all, and sharing our learning. And if it's right for us, then I think we have a role in helping others understand that. Because if we can do it when we're talking about infrastructure, and for most people, infrastructure is roads, railways, electricity grids. So if we can do it, then any other organisation, I think, should be able to take the same step.
Yeah, and David, you mentioned infrastructure there. Of course, natural infrastructure, nature's infrastructure is so important. It's so so much part of all of that. And I think we just need to take a moment before we finish just to congratulate National Infrastructure Commission for Wales for taking this really innovative and brave, and as you say, radical step, which shows some real ambition. And I think it's really wonderful, and it's been fantastic to hear the things that you've been talking about in the course of the podcast. And of course, it's been lovely to hear from Eurig about the way that that language and mythology and poetry sort of have helped to inform this decision. A really rich conversation overall. But that is all we have time for. I'd like to thank my guests, Eurig Salisbury and David Clubb. If you've enjoyed listening, please come back and listen to more. Tell your friends, like us, review us, and share our links. And we're pleased to announce that Farmgate was recently placed second in the world for food security and third for Regen Ag in the FeedSpot Global Podcast Rankings. Farmgate Leaders, Wheat from the Chaff, and our Filling the Funding Gap series are all available if you just scroll back in your podcast feed. Farmgate is part of 8.9.com, the land use news channel, which is sponsored by First Milk, Pelican Ag, Rural Solutions, the Usk Catchment Partnership, Agrolo, and individual donors. I've been Finlo Costain. Bye for now.